Everyone, welcome to the third curriculum primer video, and this one is about how knowledge is organised within each discipline. So in the first couple of videos, we first looked at what is a knowledge-rich curriculum, why is this stuff important, and I brought in these categories to do with rigour and accessibility, and the fact that what we're trying to do with a knowledge-rich curriculum is find a balance between those two. In the second video, I looked at the various disciplines and how they how the school subjects lead towards various disciplines that are studied at an academic level and try to generate knowledge. And I made what I think is an important point that, yes, in part, our subjects help prepare students to study those disciplines. Also, taken together, those subjects make what we call a general education. And that idea of togetherness, that idea of an integrated whole, so that students can take multiple perspectives and learn to live with others, that's a really, really important part of what we're trying to achieve. Now, what we're going to look at in this third video is how within each of those disciplines, and I'm thinking about disciplines here rather than school subjects, although obviously the two are linked, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But how knowledge within those disciplines is organised. Now, I've put organised in inverted commas here because this knowledge isn't somewhere, it's not in a filing cabinet somewhere and people have organised it according to kind of fixed rules. All that really exists is the disciplines, and knowledge is just essentially being able to participate in those disciplines. So when we talk about knowledge and it being organised, this is the attempt by curriculum theorists to make sense of the characteristics of people involved in different disciplines. And there's some really important principles here, and I'm going to introduce this idea of horizontal and vertical knowledge structures, but there's really important principles here for how we organise the curriculum within each of our subjects, and that is something that's there, and you could put it in a filing cabinet or an Excel spreadsheet or whatever, but we've got to be aware when we're thinking about how we organise the curriculum in the school subject, how that fits with what's happening at this kind of broader, more diffuse disciplinary level. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go through a couple of examples of subjects. So if we look at physics first, this is my subject. Now really I should have started a bit more concrete here. I've gone straight into looking at some concepts here like this. But if we take it even more at an even more kind of primary level, what physics is trying to do is trying to look at all of these diverse phenomena that are observable in the natural world and try and make sense of them and organize them in terms of physical concepts. Now, some of the concepts that we study with students, I'm thinking I chose the first one that I do in the Greenshaw Learning Trust shared science curriculum. I do stuff about particles and energy here. So we cover things like states of matter, temperature, heating, density, pressure. And these explain lots and lots of different things like, I don't know, melting and boiling and changes in temperature, convection, conduction, radiation, all of that stuff. All of these things that we want to explain, we can use some concepts to organize these. Now, these concepts were developed over time, at different times actually. It's not necessarily in this order, but throughout in the history of physics, these concepts were developed. But what physicists are trying to do, and what happened actually in these cases, all in, well, certainly these two in the 19th century, what physicists try to do is take various concepts that have been developed to explain phenomena, like these ones, and they try and reduce them down to even broader, more organizing concepts. So, in this case, the idea of particles bumping around into each other and colliding and so on, and this big organizing idea of energy taken with the Newtonian idea of forces, they can reduce down all of those concepts into even broader ones. And these are what are often called big ideas and so on, because if you get an understanding of these ones, then you can kind of understand these ones. Now this is really, really important in terms of how we develop our curriculum, because before we talk about any of these things, that suggests that we need to give students some idea of these kind of broader, more organizing concepts. So you can't really start on states of matter until you've talked about the fact that matter is made up of tiny particles. That's an organizing idea. You can't really talk about temperature and heating until you've talked about this idea of energy and the kinetic energy of particles and so on. So essentially, the way the discipline develops is kind of this way. So we take these concepts that we develop to explain concrete phenomena, and we try and come up with more abstract concepts that organize those. What's interesting here is that quite often the way the subject develops is then this way, back upwards, and we start with the biggest ideas, the most organizing concepts, and we kind of build up from there. Although that's a slightly different question. But the important point here is the way knowledge develops is this way. Now you could then even go on later, this idea of particles, the idea of forces and so on. Actually, there are even broader, more organizing concepts which have been developed in the 20th century, which we don't really teach students at school, but you could talk about fields. And that's an even more broader organizing concept that could come down here, which isn't really addressed in loads of detail at school. But the idea is that the way knowledge develops is by moving downwards like this. And we'll talk about that in terms of vertical very shortly. Could say the same about maths. So in maths, again, we've got lots of these things. There's all sorts of concrete phenomena that we can study using these mathematical concepts. Here are some of the mathematical concepts that you might find at Key Stage 3 and so on. But you can kind of reduce those down to even broader, more organizing concepts like this. And again, what as teachers we have to bear in mind is that if we're going to organize all of these concepts, well, we're going to need to think about teaching these ones first. So in both of these cases, these are what have been called by a theorist called Bernstein, or Bernstein, I never know how to pronounce it, but these are what you'd call vertical knowledge structures. And Bernstein, as always with Bernstein, says it in a much more complicated way. I'm just going to guess that I've interpreted it in the right way, but essentially it's this idea that you have this kind of hierarchical structure of knowledge where concepts build on top of one another. And that's really, really important, as I've said, for how we think about organizing the curriculum. Now let's look at some different subjects. So if we now move down here, we can look at, sorry, I'll get my visualizer. So, right, we can look at English next. Now, English is slightly different. English doesn't have this vertical knowledge structure, as we've talked about before. Because what happens in English is, you will take a text. Let's take Macbeth as an example. Now, how is knowledge generated about Macbeth? Well, the first thing that happens in English, and this is not an academic discipline, this is one of the arts, is Macbeth is written. So Macbeth is written, and it is what it is. Shakespeare is not necessarily thinking about all of these abstract concepts. He just writes a story about this king and the king's, well, no, he became the king, didn't he? And his wife and so on and so forth. That happens. Now what happens next is we get this sub-discipline develops where people talk about Macbeth. And they say, well, do you know what? Macbeth is actually a play about ambition. The key idea of Macbeth is about ambition. And someone else says, well, it's about pride as well. And someone else says, actually, I think the main idea about Macbeth is guilt. And someone else says, guys, you're all looking at it in too superficial a way. Actually, Macbeth is a play about love. And what you have is this ongoing conversation of people talking about Macbeth and bringing in new concepts to help explain what's going on. Now, what's important about these concepts that help to explain Macbeth is they're not like those scientific concepts we saw before. So it's not like the concepts you get in physics where you start with states of matter and temperature. Actually, you can reduce those down to these broader concepts of particles and energy. These concepts are not reducible. And arguably they are, but that's not necessarily what scholars of literature are trying to do. So it's not, the goal is not to reduce these down to even broader, more organizing concepts like we saw in maths and science. Actually, the goal is to come up with new ways of understanding and interpreting Macbeth. So whereas in maths and science we saw this vertical motion or this kind of vertical direction in the generation of knowledge, we wanted to come up with even broader concepts. What we want to do in a subject like English is move horizontally. So we want to move that way and come up with new concepts that can help to explain one single text. And I think that's really, really important in terms of how we organise our curriculum, as we'll talk about in a minute. I'll just show another example. So we can talk about history. So in history, quite often you'll see this acronym of MAIN, militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, to explain the causes of the First World War. Now, what a historian would want to do is think, well, are there other ways I could explain it? Now, I'm not a historian, but let's say, I don't know, a historian comes up with the idea that actually no one's talked about gender here. So maybe actually the First World War was about the emancipation of women or something like that. Probably historians would criticize that interpretation that I've just made up off the top of my head. But the point is here, what the historian, like the English scholar, is trying to do is move that way. So we have the events, and rather than trying to organize it, sort of build these broader, more organizing concepts like we try and do in maths and science, what we want to do is come up with new interpretations of this one thing that we happen to be studying. So these two, English and history, are what we call horizontal knowledge structures. Horizontal. And what that means is there's something quite different. So whereas in maths and science we saw that actually we need to think about, okay, if we're going to teach about all of this stuff in maths, let's start with these core ideas of number and proportionality, let's say, time and space, whatever that might be. It's not quite the same in English, because actually what we need to do in English, and the same could be said for history, is we need to make sure that before students study Macbeth, they have seen multiple examples of texts addressing this idea of ambition. So they've got things to draw upon when they come to read Macbeth. Same about pride, same about guilt, same about love, because they need to be building their interpretations by analogy to other texts. So actually the way you organize a curriculum is not so kind of sequential and hierarchical. It's not kind of, okay, you have to do this, then you have to do this, then you have to do this. You could bring in any sort of text, provided it introduces the concepts that students are going to need to draw upon when they get to the later texts. What's also interesting about these horizontal structures, I mean, certainly more so with English than with history, let's say. So history, these are still quite abstract. They're quite alien to students' everyday understandings. So apart from maybe alliances, but certainly things like militarism, imperialism, nationalism, they're not things students will be really, really familiar with. But what's interesting about English is they will already come into school with a sense of what ambition means and pride and guilt and love. They'll have these experiences. But what we want to do is develop these, make them a bit more multifaceted, so they're not just drawing on very kind of basic everyday experiences. They're able to draw upon what they've learned from different texts. But again, hopefully that gives you a sense of, firstly, how knowledge is organised differently within the different subjects, and secondly, how that is going to help subject leaders in different subjects think about their curriculum. Rather than building up hierarchically in English and history and other horizontal subjects, what we need to do is just make sure that students come back to these concepts again and again and again through different texts and so on. That's the end of this video. In the next video, I think I will address the two categories that were introduced in the previous video, this idea of a general and a specialised education.